I'm all like this, eh? Now here we dey May 29th. Before we know it dey happen, I be gbey. Fuel subsidy is gone. As the matter don dey over, it don go pass our back. Go reintroduce fuel subsidy. Anyway, this SAN Olisa Agbakoba, he don come and he don come tell us how Emilio Conte secretly reintroduce fuel subsidy without say not tell us this time around, and the way the matter dey go now. Watch the video, share am, make everybody see, make dem know the solve for the country.
You've been very vocal recently about the government's economic policies, and more specifically, you've been talking about the fallout from the removal of the fuel subsidy and the government's plan to dispense some form of cash palliative. I mean, you would rather institutional palliatives in preference to cash. Tell us more about that and whether you're seeing a clear policy on this from President Tinubu.
Right, thank you very much. So we go back to the beginning. President Tinubu issued a manifesto of what he'll do when he gets into government. And I know that I read it very clearly. I read that of Peter Obi and Alhaji Atiku Abubakar. And so, and I say this without prejudice to the fact that there's a case in court. And let me also make a distinction between the state and the person who occupies the office of president. They're two different persons. I'm always very loyal to the state, but not to the person occupying the office. But whoever occupies the office, in the case of President Tinubu, until the Supreme Court decides whatever way, the state has to continue. So my comments are in respect of the state. You remember Louis XIV saying the state is, I'm the state. But under an earlier big French envoy, the state, the concept of the state and the person was separated. So President Tinubu, even though he's Nigerian president, isn't the state. So I make comments as to how the state's economy can move forward. So when I look at all what's on ground, there were two big headwinds as Captain Tinubu took off on his aircraft into the climb mode. And he was hit by a lot of turbulent winds, a couple of headwinds. I still think, although commentators disagree on what's the correct position, but I disagree that President Tinubu was wrong to correct the economy by removing the subsidy thing. I think he was right. And I also think he was right to do the thing on the exchange process. Where I think President Tinubu climbed as a pilot in his aircraft, what I think he did was he shifted the power gear. You can shift it from 0 to 100%. But I see the shift only 30, 40, 50%. And I'm wondering why it isn't going down, fully. And if it went down fully, what will happen would be a set of priority policy statements relating to how institutional as against personal palliatives could issue. The reason I have a problem with personal palliatives is I'm not sure the effect that it had under the past president and what it will have now. So I make a couple of points. One would be, what's the present problem now in Nigeria? I think it's transport. Fuel is out of hand. And is there a way that we could reduce fuel costs from, say, 600, 700 to 300, 200? And I think there's a way. And I suggested that in an article that I did last week. Why is it not possible? Why must we sell domestic consumption, crude domestic consumption in dollars? Is there a reason for that? We consume, say, $400,000, $500,000 barrels of crude every day. Why couldn't the NNPC or whatever agency is responsible for selling it to the 27 odd local refineries in Naira? There are three critical costs to bear in mind in crude. One is the crude cost, the Naira cost of crude, which is called cost crude. Then the tax is put on, which is called tax crude, and then the profit, which is called profit crude. Why can't we sell to our local people in Naira? I don't understand why. And I was saying the other day, if this occurred, we would find that there was a possibility. I haven't given the matter very serious consideration, so these are just sweeping economic thoughts in my head. But I have a feeling that if we did some mathematics, we might see ourselves halving the price of fuel. And now, people might say, but are you not coming back to subsidy? And I say, no. Every government in the world does subsidy. Actually, right now, President Tinubu has introduced or reintroduced subsidy for fuel consumption without telling us. It's clear that if we applied international prices to fuel, it should be doing 1,000, 1,100, but it's only at 600 to 700. So let's stop all the hypocrisy. Let's encourage local production. Let's sell the refineries, the 4 refineries. Let's allow the indigenous owners of modular refineries to come on board. The other day they were on television saying that they can produce between 50 and 100,000. So if we collect and mop up all this, I think it'll be possible to reduce the cost of crude. The difference between the subsidizing crude and PMS is that the thievery might stop. In the case of PMS, it was to a bunch of people. But in this case, for crude, the subsidy would go to those who are refining crude locally.
Right. Well,
and I feel very strongly that
your
that
advice,
would be of...
Yeah, your advice is a good one, and I think that it's got considerable merit, but there is no saying, I mean, Tinubu's government has only been around for 5 months. I mean, there's no saying, although I understand what you mean, the moment you've got to strike whilst the iron is hot, and the iron is pretty hot right now. Therefore, people need to feel that sense of, you know, the government taking action. But I think the point that you made was that you were referring to institutional palliatives, this being one of them. But the other ones that you talked about was things like education, like, you know, deferring the payment of school fees and all the rest of them. And I wanted you to get into a little bit of that and explain it briefly.
Right, sure. So I prefer institutional palliatives. This is not to say that personal palliatives don't work, but I don't believe that they are really targeting those designed to get them. So institutional palliative is like quantitative easing. And so what you do, you identify. I mean, I'm not the president, so he's the one who has to do the study. All I can do is to suggest. If he accepts the concept of institutional palliatives, then what are those things that we can, you know, bring into the basket? For instance, they've done one very well. Diesel. Diesel is 7.5% on VAT has been removed. So that's institutional palliative. It goes to everybody. When you say institutional, it means everybody is affected by the action of government. Then you identify all school children across the 36 states and say to them, fees are abolished for 2 years. That's institutional palliative. Go into the medical field and you do the same. And then you can go on and look for, say, 10 institutional items which, if you applied, would ease the lives of Nigerians that are going right now through great suffering. So that's what I meant by, you know, government should first of all realize that there's great suffering. And I was just, you know, reflecting on what is the meaning of economic policy. Economic policy means a policy designed for the empowerment and securing the lives and ensuring that we all in Nigeria have a good life. The Americans call it, in their Declaration of Independence statement, the pursuit of happiness. That is what economic policy is all about. It's not about GDP is going to do 9% and all those figures we see from the National Bureau of Statistics. Ask the average Nigerian on the street, what is it that I'm looking for? And I think what they're looking for is how government can create a packet of institutional benefits and palliatives that will make their lives better. And that's what I meant by...
That's a very good point. I mean, I didn't realize that you have such good economic experience. I would have been having you on the show talking about economy all the time. But since we've got into the area of economic policy, let's talk about Nigeria's revenue profile, because all these things have to a lesser or greater extent, be funded. I mean, this country seems to be technically insolvent, although some would argue that there's no clarity on that. Nevertheless, are you satisfied with the government's public sector borrowing and how it's planning to pay down Nigeria's debt?
No, because you don't owe. If you say you're owing money, that means that you really can't pay. It's the case that Nigeria cannot manage its debt profile. So the starting point is to come up with some statistical scales. So I would do a PSBR, public sector borrowing requirement. Exactly how much do we need to borrow? We need to be sure about that. What are we borrowing for? We need to be sure about that. If I were anywhere near government and advising, I would say the first thing to do is to say, can we sustain our debt profile? We can't, it's too high. And the second thing to say is, do we have the revenues to deal with this? Unfortunately, everyone, including President Tinubu's appointment of the tax reform committee, focuses on only one aspect of Section 162 public revenue profile. Section 162 of the Constitution provides two types of public revenue. One is tax, which is going very well, FIRS, petroleum profit tax, company, personal income tax, all of that. Nobody has ever thought about non-tax revenue. Now, non-tax revenue, I've done a study. I submitted a study to the last Minister of Finance, and I was happy that as a result of my letter, she publicly admitted that the government had 33 trillion naira in what is called MOFI. MOFI is the Ministry of Finance Incorporated. This keeps all Nigeria's assets. So if Nigeria has 33 trillion, and she called this a preliminary study, and she's been out of office for the last 6-7 months, so why is it not playing up in our entire financial calculations? If our current budget deficit is 12 trillion, and we have 33 trillion in MOFI, so what's the problem? Are we really broke, or is it that we're not looking for the revenues we ought to be looking for? I have 10 clearly identified sources of revenue, public revenue, that if systematically and pushed very hard, could in 2 years result in 100 trillion with about 6 million jobs. I need to hear government say something about that sort of thing. I mean, kudos to Minister Wike. I like the takeoff he's made in Abuja. That's what I want to see everywhere across all the other ministries. Action. First, in aviation, yes, he's gotten off the ground. Sports minister seems to be pushing well. I heard him speak today. But apart from that, that's it. So we need to understand what's the policy of this government on the economy. And there are at least 3 things to look at. Macroeconomic, which is central bank. And by the way, Mr. Cardoso's unbanning 43 items sounds more like trade policy rather than monetary. I don't know that unbanning and saying, okay, you guys can now, source for Forex represents an advance in our economy. I would have loved to hear the Minister of Trade say more about that than Mr. Cardoso. Anyway, we need 3 things to converge: monetary, fiscal, and trade policy. These are the 3 things that need to converge. So we need to be very clear where we're going. And a lot of times I say to myself, we should recall that the Japanese yen is in a large domination compared to the dollar. What's this big deal about Naira being 1,000 to $1? Does it really matter? We're not producing. So the Naira should be the productive value rather than the numeric value. It doesn't matter whether the naira is 5,000 to 1. What matters is what is being produced. Our production capacity right now is very poor. So this is where I expect Captain Tinubu on board his aircraft as he's lifting off to push down the throttle and create a policy, a very clear policy on trade. Do we want to shut our markets? Do we want to make it protective so that our local manufacturers can have the confidence to develop business? Now, if all of this is playing out, then in a year or two, we should begin to see the impact of excess revenue rather than a depleted revenue pause that we see today.